All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming to Honouliuli's 10th anniversary Hidden Histories speaker event this evening. This is our first speaker event of August. And my name is Gian. I am Honouliuli National Historic Sites biotechnician. I'm also the education and outreach lead, as well as the volunteer coordinator. And I'm super, super thrilled to be here today. If people want to just type in the chat, how did you hear about this event? We're always curious. How do people find out about these events? Is it just random, or are you following us, or what is it? And we also would like to know where you're watching from. So we usually have a pretty international audience, and we always like to see where people tune in from. So if you just want to drop that in the chat, yeah, well, you guys can keep introducing yourselves in the chat. I'm going to move on to introducing our guest of the evening. So speaking today is Dr. Alan Rosenfeld. So he will be presenting lessons from Camp Honouliuli, breaking down myths and assumptions about wartime internment in Hawaii. So Dr. Alan Rosenfeld is the Associate Vice President for Academic Programs and Policy for the University of Hawaii System. In this capacity, he partners with the 10 UH campuses and various UH system offices to provide leadership in academic program and policy development, as well as articulation, transfer, strategic planning, intercampus academic program collaboration, and the university's efforts to address state workforce needs. Alan spent 14 years at UH West Oahu, where he earned tenure and promotion to Professor of History. He also served as the Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs and the WSCUC Accreditation Liaison Officer at UH West, having previously held faculty roles as Humanities Division Chair and Faculty Senate Chair. He earned his BA in History at the University of Pennsylvania, followed by an MA and PhD in Modern German History at the University of California, Irvine. So without further ado, I would like to hand it off to Alan, who is going to be presenting today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. Thank you to the National Park Service for organizing the speaker series and for inviting me to be included. And aloha, I see a lot of familiar names, a couple of still shot familiar faces. And so thank you so much to everyone who turned out for this talk tonight. And I'll jump on the screen share. And we're off. Thank you for your patience on that one. All right, so tonight I'm going to just talk a little bit about myths and assumptions that people might have about internment and the internment experience specifically in Hawaii during World War II and centered around the Honouliuli internment camp. So I'm really using the concept of a myth as a rhetorical device here, just to kind of engage with my audience, engage with you folks, and get the conversation started. So these are just some things that may or may not surprise you. I don't mean to suggest that these are very ingrained myths that are circulating around the population with regularity, but just some things that might surprise you about the internment experience in Hawaii. So here we go. Just a little background about myself and how I got involved in the project and the different facets of the project in question. So originally I was a scholar of modern Germany. And so when I came to UH West Oahu back in 2008, I started to branch out. West Oahu is not a very well endowed, it doesn't have a huge endowment, a lot of funding. So in order to do our research, it really helped to try to find something we could do locally without traveling halfway around the world. And we had a research group set up at UH West Oahu, led by Dr. Suzanne Falgu, who is on the call from New Orleans. I saw that. Aloha, Suzanne. And a couple of other colleagues I saw. I'm sorry if I missed anyone. I saw Dr. Joyce Chinen and Dr. Garen Suru on the call as well as we were logging in. They were all part of this interdisciplinary research team. One of the big things, we got a grant from the National Park Service. So here I am repaying the debt, 15 years later, as it were. And through that grant, a bunch of us were giving different kinds of talks around the islands. We also visited the National Archives. Some of us, myself included, visited the National Archives just outside of Washington, D.C. in 2010. Not myself, but some of my colleagues, including Dr. Fagu, ran an archaeological field school that took students to the internment site itself, which, for those who don't know, is located just opposite of Royal Cunha on what is now Monsanto land. And they led students to go in and actually do the excavation work and the mapping work as well, and uncover the structures and uncover the buried history as well. And this kind of culminated in a special journal issue we did back in 2014, I believe, in the Journal of Social Process. And so the entire issue focused on the Honouliuli internment camp. Personally, myself, although I was a scholar, I still am a scholar of modern Germany. I guess I'm out of the classroom these days doing admin work, but on a personal level, I lived in Japan. My wife and son are Japanese nationals, and I speak Japanese. And so I was volunteering at the Japanese Cultural Center, and they have an archive there, where I volunteered, which houses a large collection of materials related to internment, largely some that they got from other archives, including the National Archives, but especially materials that were donated by the relatives of different local internees. As I was doing all of this, I figured, well, I'm doing all this research work, so I might as well connect my research with my teaching, and I created a quirky, unique course called Hawaii During World War II. But I think it was a very valuable experience for the students, because they could really connect. I mean, we had times where we were doing assigned readings in class, talking about, one was a book that Franklin Otto did on the Varsity Victory Volunteers. And so I had students saying, oh, this is my uncle, the person they're talking about in the book. Like, they had direct connections with participants in the stories that we were learning about. So without further ado, I will go into my first myth, quote unquote, my first myth of the day. Okay. Authorities decided whom to intern after the attack on Pearl Harbor. That is largely a myth. And the reason for that is that they already had lists of people to be interned prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor. So this was true across the United States, but also these lists were developed across the United States, called custodial detention lists. Now, in Hawaii, in 1939, they reopened the FBI office. It shared quarters with the Military Intelligence Division of the U.S. Army in this building pictured right here, which was on Dillingham, or was the Dillingham Boulevard, Dillingham Building, it was called, sorry. And so they worked in close collaboration also with the Office of Naval Intelligence. And already prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, just for Hawaii alone, they had a list of 456 names, many of whom were U.S. citizens. And these were people who were going to be apprehended in the event of the onset of war, most ostensibly with Japan. And the people on these lists did not know that their names were there. And oftentimes their names were there because of information that informants provided to FBI agents, and other reasons as well that I'll address over the course of this presentation. Oops. Well, I did actually want to do this. So I wanted to skip forward to this slide. I clicked on it by accident. I was trying to let someone in from the waiting room, but I wanted to skip forward to this slide and return to the last bullet on the previous slide. I am an historian by trade, and so I do need to provide some level of relevant historical context. I promise it will be a short journey, and then we'll return to the different myths and we'll tackle them one at a time. But just to understand what martial law was and what it meant for the people of Hawaii is really essential here. So the first was the proclamation itself. The attack on Pearl Harbor, the onset was early in the morning, December 7th, Sunday morning. People were at rest, were caught off guard, 8 o'clock in the morning or so. By 12:10, General Short, head of the U.S. Army in Hawaii, was in the office of Governor Poindexter with a proclamation of martial law, which, as it turns out, had been already drafted months prior and was ready and on hand just in case. So Governor Poindexter was a bit hesitant as to what to do. He he contacted the White House, President Roosevelt, certainly a good idea. He felt a bit under duress, but nevertheless, by 4:25 p.m., martial law was declared, and it did not fully end until October 1944. So that was 34 months of martial law. It's important to point out that the legal basis for the declaration of martial law in Hawaii was rooted in the Organic Act, which is a document that provided the basis for the annexation of Hawaii as a territory of the United States. And according to that document, martial law was predicated on an imminent danger, which certainly on December 7th, 1941 was present, right? There was certainly an imminent danger. Okay, so what did martial law mean? So that meant, first of all, there was a military governor. So civilian government was done. The army general, initially Short, took over the government. The civilian courts were closed. There was a curfew put in place initially from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. And there were wardens that were patrolling the streets to make sure that people followed the curfew, and you would be arrested and sent to provost courts, which I'll explain in a second, if you violated it. There was mass censorship. So they literally had people opening the mail, opening your letters. They had about 30 different translators for about 30 different languages. And you might get a letter in the mail with pieces cut out because there were censors who would intercept it and redact things. The radios and newspapers were taken over by the military, and the Japanese language newspapers stopped printing. There was rationing of materials, not just gasoline, but many other items, and price controls were put in place over a wide range of both items, products, and services. Everyone in the territory was fingerprinted and registered, and they had to carry ID cards at all times. There were cases where the military authorities raided movie theaters, checking for ID cards, and arrested those who didn't have them. So this is the situation we're looking at. And I mentioned the civil courts were closed, and in their place, there were provost courts, which were military courts. There a couple of scholars, actually a married couple of scholars, Harry and Jane Scheiber, have done the most research on this point, and I've cited them. So habeas corpus, which I'll talk about later in the presentation, was suspended, so they didn't need a warrant to arrest everyone. They could just swoop them all up. And not just internees, but anyone in the public, they didn't have, habeas corpus was suspended. So you were sent to provost courts, usually the same day as your arrest. The trials lasted 5 minutes. There was over 90% guilty verdicts, immediate sentencing, no rights of appeal, and the Scheibers counted over 30,000 trials like this in a single year. Okay, so you can do the math. That's like almost 100 trials a day, 5 minutes each. You're immediately guilty 90% of the time. 10% of the time you're innocent, and you're immediately sentenced and put in whatever. Sometimes it could be a fine or whatever the case may be. And then the last part here that I want before I circle back to the first myth is the context of alien enemies in the Alien Enemies Act. So that was used by the FBI and by J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, as a justification for arresting Japanese, Germans, and Italians in Hawaii and elsewhere immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So by December 9th in Hawaii, somewhere between 473 and 485 people had already been arrested as internees. But the declaration of war against Germany and Italy didn't even happen until 2 days later. And there were many people arrested in Hawaii as Japanese enemy aliens or alien enemies prior to the formal declaration of war against Japan as well. So now if I can figure out how to do this right without messing it up, I'll skip back to my prior slide. Uh-oh, it's not letting me. Wait, here's the arrow. Okay. And so, yeah, so everything was the FBI working with the Navy and the Army had a lot of preparations in place in terms of figuring out who would be interned. And also they mapped out how they would actually apprehend them. What they did not plan properly for at all was the facilities to house the internees. So initially they were in absolutely atrocious conditions. So here you see a picture on the bottom right of Sand Island, which was initially the largest internment facility immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was formerly a quarantine station close to the immigration station on Almona Boulevard, where the hearings took place, and I'll talk about the hearings later. And initially, the internees slept on these tents, which you can see, on cots that did not have mattresses. And in high tide, the water level would rise so that the cots were submerged in water. And they didn't have proper food initially. For the first couple of weeks, they didn't have proper food. Some internees reported they were eating leaves off of bushes instead of vegetables. There was a 15-foot high fence with barbed wire and armed guards on patrol as well. On Kauai, there were, I want to say the number was about 50 people. I might be misremembering that, who were stuffed initially in the old Kauai County Jail, and there was complete lack of facilities there for the first several days. There were all these, because they were all men, an initial group of internees on Kauai, and they were sharing a single bucket as restroom facilities without getting into too much there. So Maui as well, initially they had 56 people in a recreation room of the old Wailuku County Jail. So until there were more proper, thorough facilities constructed, people were in really makeshift and inappropriate settings. So here we go. Myth number 2. Only people of Japanese ancestry were interned in Hawaii. Okay, so I'm going to break this down. Now, first I should say the vast majority of the internees were Japanese in Hawaii, and of course nationally as well, were Japanese and Japanese American. And the Japanese community certainly suffered the most. There was a lot of animosity, more so on the mainland than in Hawaii, but also in Hawaii against the Japanese because of what had happened at Pearl Harbor. And the Japanese essentially had this massive cultural attack because their newspapers were shut down. The Japanese language schools had to shut down because the teachers were interned. The Buddhist temples, the Shinto shrines, everything essentially came to a grinding halt. So even if you weren't interned and you were suspected of being disloyal by the military and by many of the Caucasian population, right? So I'm not engaging any kind of competitive victimization discourse here. Clearly, the Japanese community suffered the most. Okay. But now when we break this down, we have the great scholar, retired scholar, Dr. Joyce Chinen on the call, unless she dropped off. I can't check right now in the middle of the talk. But I actually did mention you today, Joyce, when I spoke on the Hawaii Public Radio. So Joyce, Dr. Chinen mapped out, looking at the Japanese names of the internees in Hawaii, figuring out that between 12 and 15% of them were probably Okinawan based on their surnames. And then a large number were also Korean, right? Because both Okinawa and Korea at the time, before the time, but also during the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, had been occupied and colonized and occupied and annexed by Japan. So they were Japanese subjects according to the United States, and they were in actuality as well. And so many of the people who were arrested as Japanese were actually Okinawans and Koreans. Also, if we look at the Germans and Italians who were interned in Hawaii, although the number of German and Italian residents in Hawaii was very small compared to the number of Japanese. The Japanese, by the way, there were between 150 and 160,000 residents of Hawaii who had Japanese ancestry, which was about 38% of the entire population of Hawaii. They were the largest demographic group. Germans and Italians, very small in numbers. However, the ones that were here were interned in very large degree, like basically en masse. I'll dig into this deeper, but many of the people who were actually interned as Germans in Hawaii were not German at all, not even ethnically German. I found people who were Finnish. I found people who were Norwegian. I found someone who was Irish, not part German. So they might be married to someone who's German, but so yeah, vast majority were Japanese, but many people of many other ancestries were also interned during World War II. And need to find my mouse. Here we go. Another myth. The civilian internees were tried and convicted of crimes. Okay, so what do we mean by the word tried? So here's where I'll dig in a little bit and talk about the hearing boards. So when I did my research, funded by National Park Service, thank you. When I did my research at the National Archives outside of DC, one treasure trove of documentation that I came across were the transcripts from the hearing boards. So these were the closest things that internees had to a trial. It was not a trial as we know it, and I'm going to explain how these things work, how the hearing boards and the hearings themselves worked. Okay, so on the US mainland, they also had the hearing boards and the hearings, and there were civilian boards, and they had 3 members board members, right? Hearing board members who ran the hearings. However, only in Hawaii, there was always at least one military officer who was part of the board, sometimes 2. And what I learned from accessing and then studying these transcripts is that the military officer always or almost always served as the executive and recorder of the hearing. And that meant because the only hearing board members I found in Hawaii, all of them were men. All of them were men. I don't know of any female hearing board member. So the military officer was the one who called forth the witness and the defendants and excused them and posed the vast majority of the questions. And also, as part of the structure of these hearings, you should know that the defendants, the internees, were physically removed from the hearing boardroom whenever there was testimony, any witness testimony, whether it was their own witnesses or whether it was government witnesses. And there was no disclosure whatsoever. So they did not know even who the witnesses were, let alone what they were going to say. And they had no rights of appeal. And technically, they could have an attorney. I've probably seen 75 of these hearing board transcripts, and I only saw one case in which anyone ever had an attorney. So I saw cases where they asked people if they need an attorney, but typically they had spent a month, could be a couple of weeks, could be a couple of months, 3 months, at that immigration building, and then at Sand Island in the cots, with no mattresses at first. They were brought across by ferry to the immigration building. After a couple of months in those circumstances, they're brought in for the hearing and they're asked, do you need a lawyer at your own expense? The government did not provide a lawyer. And a lot of them said, I don't have any money. And others, rightfully, understandably, felt that if they said yes, right, that would likely be viewed as suspicious. And if you said, yes, I need an attorney, well, you don't have one immediate. There's no government attorney present, defense attorney. You'd be shipped back to Sand Island. You'd have to wait a few more months in captivity until you could get your attorney. So inevitably, and none of the Germans and Italians that I've looked at, none of them had attorneys that I know of, that I've seen. And quite the contrary, they often said, they can't afford them. Okay. No cross-examination. And the cases on the long end, they could go up to 4 days. On the short end, they ran about 10 or 15 minutes. And I even, when I taught the Hawaii during World War II class, I would take a short transcript and I would give copies to my students and assign them roles. And we read the transcript and acted it out in real time in the classroom. And I would look at my watch when we were done and I would say, we started at 6:14 class. Well, it wouldn't be 6:14, but I'm using the current time here. And now it's 6:26. We just went through that whole hearing and it took 12 minutes, right? So they could see, maybe witnesses coming in and out. Maybe it's a couple more minutes, right? But they were incredibly short. And here's the kicker. So the hearing board then makes a decision of whether to release the person, release them on parole, or send them back for a continued internment. But that decision then subsequently went to a 3-person board consisting of the heads of the FBI, the Office of Naval Intelligence, and the Military Intelligence Division. And they could overturn the decision of the hearing board. And I have seen cases when that happened, and all of those cases that I've come across were only to the detriment of the internee. So the hearing board said, you're innocent, you can go, and then the 3-person FBI, ONI, MID review team said, no, back to Sand Island. Now, that is like, you can imagine today you're arrested and you go to a jury trial and you're found innocent, or you go for a judge and you're found innocent, and then it goes back to the arresting officer who says, no, I don't agree, you're guilty. Because the FBI, ONI, MID, they're the ones who actually created the lists that determined who would be interned in the first place, right? So they're essentially the prosecution here. Well, they are. The FBI were the prosecutors in the hearings themselves. Okay, so just a side note there, this is a picture. I don't have any pictures of the hearing boards. So this is a picture of the provost courts, which I mentioned earlier, and which we said had 30,000 cases in 1 year. So far more active, many more cases, but also similar in the sense of the complete absence of any semblance of jurisprudence as we know it. All right. Next, here we go for the next myth. And no, that was the previous myth. All right. Hopefully I'm a better speaker than I am as a PowerPoint slide deck operator. I'm failing miserably in that regard. Civilian internees committed crimes. Almost never. Now, I've got a couple of cases here that kind of have asterisks. They're both well-known cases. They're things that you can read about on Wikipedia. So the first one's Otto Kuhn. So Otto Kuhn was a German citizen who moved to Oahu in the 1930s with his wife and children. He owned a home in Lanikai, and he was accused of using lights from his beach home to flash and signal and assist the Japanese attack forces leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor. So although he was German, he was accused of assisting the Japanese. So his defense essentially was that he took the money, so he was on the payroll of the Japanese government, but that he didn't actually follow through and send the signal. So he was tried and convicted in the US and sentenced to death, but then later deported to Germany instead. So that's one case, but he wasn't, I don't think that's indicative of the larger civilian population. It seems that but we don't know for sure if he was sort of recruited to move to Hawaii. But in any case, that's one case sort of that we have, right? And the other case consists of Takeo Yoshikawa. Now, Takeo Yoshikawa was not a local resident per se, not a civilian resident. So he was someone who was trained, and he was a Japanese national, trained and recruited in Japan and sent by the Japanese Naval Intelligence to Hawaii as a 29-year-old to gather intelligence on Pearl Harbor. So he went undercover, essentially. He grew his hair out long. He used to sit in coffee shops in Aiea overlooking Pearl Harbor and keeping keeping logs on the ships and when the ships were at port and when they would go out. He once managed to get into a taxi cab and actually get onto the Pearl Harbor base. So he was doing reconnaissance, doing spy work for Japan, but he was using a false name on a false passport. He was ostensibly an employee at the Japanese consulate in Honolulu before the attack on Pearl Harbor. So he was not a regular civilian. So really, it's almost negligible in terms of people actually having committed any crimes. Okay. So the next one we have, right, well, you think to yourself, okay, maybe they didn't commit crimes, but they must have been engaged in some sort of disloyal and subversive activity. So let's explore that one a bit as well. So it's true that some Japanese folks in Hawaii, especially the Issei, the Japanese citizens who were first-generation immigrants were loyal to Japan, but that wasn't problematic until the attack on Pearl Harbor, right? So from the time of the Japanese invasion, the full invasion of China in 1937 until the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, there was this period where a lot of residents, Japanese residents in Hawaii, were collecting funds to send to support Japan, and they were creating care packages to send to Japanese. They were called imonbukuro. They would create these care packages to send to Japanese soldiers fighting in China. But that is, not anti-American because the United States wasn't involved in the war at that time. Of course, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, those types of activities were viewed with great suspicion. All right. So now I'm sorry, I have a foreign word, a Japanese word here. I do want to use the Japanese word, and this is a big piece of the puzzle, and it's toritsugini. So it has in the past been translated as consular agents, and I do not like that translation. I can give you the literal translation. It won't help that much, but it's interesting. Toritsu is for registration. For someone who speaks Japanese, you might know that. Gi is like from giri, like an obligation, responsibility, and nin just means person. So the reason I say that to call them consular agents is misleading is because these were actually unpaid volunteers, okay? They were unpaid volunteers who lived, local civilians. They were not consular officials. They were unpaid volunteers who lived in Hawaii and were proficient in written Japanese. Why does this matter? Okay. About 77% of all the Japanese in Hawaii at the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor were second or third generation. And many of them did not have a high level of, especially written proficiency in Japanese. So there were many times they had family records back in Japan, or personal records, legal records back in Japan. And if they wanted to update them, they needed help from someone who was fluent in written Japanese, because they had to complete the paperwork in Japanese. And there was no chat GPT. You couldn't just copy and paste it in and have a nice translation, right? Okay, so who did they go to? They went to these toritsuginin, who typically were the Japanese school teachers, the Buddhist priests, the Shinto priests, right? So they needed help with these documents. So for example, I even, because I'm married to a Japanese citizen, have a family registry, a koseki tokoro, in Japan. And so when our son was born 14 years ago, we wanted to update it. So my wife had to fill out paperwork, right? So it could be as something as, and oftentimes was, something as innocuous as that. And here's the best example of how innocuous it could be. Let's say you were a Nisei in Hawaii, but technically because in Japan, so in the United States, you're a US citizen because it was based on place of birth. Citizenship was based on place of birth. In Japan, it was still based by blood. So to the Japanese, you were actually a Japanese citizen as well. So if you actually were a Nisei who was loyal to the United States and you wanted to renounce your Japanese citizenship, you needed to file expatriation paperwork in Japan. Let's say you don't read and write Japanese. So you go to your Japanese school teacher, you go to your Buddhist priest, who is a toritsugini, and he or she, usually a he, would help you do the paperwork, right? So almost all the people who were in this category were on those custodial detention lists from the start. So those were the people who got picked up, right? It doesn't mean they had done anything disloyal. Okay. Next group, smaller group, but interesting one, doesn't need as much explanation, fishermen. Why would they suspect fishermen? Well, where were you on the morning of December 7th at 6 a.m.? I was out at sea. What were you doing? Were you signaling to the Japanese naval boat? I mean, no, I was fishing. And as you know, well, I don't know if you know about fish, I mean, they would go out at night and come back the next morning. That's very, very common. So a lot of times they were out at sea, sometimes for more than one day. And so they came back the morning of December 8th. They didn't even know martial law had been declared. Some of them didn't even know that there was an attack. There had been an attack on Pearl Harbor. And so there were unidentified fishing boats returning to different ports on the islands. And some of them were actually fired upon by US military, and 6 fishermen were killed in all. One of the cases that I've I've looked at was actually Minosuke Hanabusa, who's the grandfather of politician Colleen Hanabusa. And he was a resident of Waianae and a fisherman who wound up being interned actually, I think, until October or November of 1945. So I understand the war was over. That's another story, but there were still internees from Hawaii on the mainland for months after the end of the hostilities at the end of the war. Kibe, another group. So Kibe, we've talked about the Issei, the first generation, the Japanese citizens, and the Nisei, second generation, who had U.S. citizenship. So Kibe were those who were born in the United States, but their families sent them back to Japan for education. So they might have, lived in Hawaii until they were 8 or 9, and they went back to school for 10 years in Japan. So the U.S. Military authorities in Hawaii viewed them with suspicion because they had been educated and perhaps indoctrinated in the sort of loyalty to the emperor, the cult of the emperor. And therefore, late in 1942, the authorities in Hawaii identified them and targeted them en masse and started having them go through interrogations, right? And so in the interrogations, there were a series of questions. There was like a template of questions that they asked all these Kibe. And many of these questions they also asked to other internees that were in Kibe. And so that's what I mean here by these loyalty tests. And I'll get back to the other bullet point above that. So they would ask them straight up for one example, who do you want to win the war, United States or Japan, right? So straight up loyalty. Okay. Do you own property in the United States? Do you own property in Japan? Have you served in the military in the United States? Have you served in the military in Japan? Do you have family members who served or have served in the States, in Japan? Do you have bank accounts in the United States? Do you have a bank account in Japan? Do you send money home? Right. Have you purchased any war bonds, any U.S. war bonds? Have you made blood bank donations? So these are some of the criteria. So, it's not necessarily loyalty. That's why I have it in scare quotes here. Maybe you haven't given blood because you're anemic. I don't know. You faint when someone, there's different reasons, right? Sending money home. The most common thing they said when they interviewed the internees, the Kibe and others, do you send any money back to Japan? And they would say, yeah. I send money home every month to my elderly mother. Does that mean you're disloyal? Does that mean you're disloyal to the United States of America? I would argue not. Maybe it just means you're a good son or daughter. Okay. So then I have a few examples here. I have a photograph in the top right. You might be wondering why I have the Arizona Memorial here, not just as a shout out to the NPS, although that helps as well. So Alfred Price is in the top right, and he was a renowned architect in Hawaii and the one who designed the Arizona Memorial that we all know. He designed homes on Oahu, especially. He designed the entrance to the Honolulu Zoo. He also was the founder of the Hawaii State Foundation on Culture and the Arts. Okay. And its first executive director. So Alfred Price was from Vienna. He was raised Catholic, but his father was Jewish. So when the Nazis annexed Austria in 1938, he then, according to the Nuremberg laws, was identified as a Jew and then not permitted citizenship, lost his citizenship. So he and his wife wound up fleeing and wound up in Hawaii and were then later interned as alien enemies because Austria was part of Germany and the Germany was okay. Another example here I have is a picture of Zdenka Ornstein. So there was a family of 4, Ernst and Zdenka Ornstein, and their 2 teenage boys. And they were also from Vienna. They were Jewish. So when the Nazis took over, they lost their citizenship. Ernst lost his job. They lost their home. They lost their citizenship. So they lost everything. And they left, they fled Germany with the help of fled Austria, but greater Germany, with the help of different Jewish welfare and refugee organizations. They made their way through France, Belgium, Norway, and eventually New York City, and eventually Hawaii. They got picked up. The father, the mother, and the older son all got interned in the first 48 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And I talked about this in this was part of the broadcast on HBR this morning, but they asked in the hearing transcript that I have, they asked Ernst Ornstein, well, what's your thought about Hitler and the Nazis? And he says, to me, quote, to me, it was the worst thing in the world. I will do anything I'm able to do, end quote, for America to win the war. And then they asked this question, and can you imagine how ridiculous this is? If you had to choose between Satan and Hitler, whom would you choose? And the response you can see in the transcript, it's just shock, right? Astonishment, because the first thing that Ernst says is, between what? Right? He couldn't believe the question. And he gathers himself and he says, I don't know. I think Hitler is worse in some respects. And I'll just mention here too, it's in the slide. There were two female high school students that were interned. One was a student at Punahou and one was a student at Sacred Heart Academy, and they were interned as alien enemies because they had German citizenship. So, you know, they're not engaged in any subversive activity. All right. Oops, sorry. You think I'm getting better at this, but I'm only getting worse. Next myth. Citizens were largely immune from internment. You might think, oh, it's only for enemy aliens, it's alien enemies. It's not actually for
there's
US
enough
citizens.
people that you could come up with something. Well,
Sorry, put that one on mute. Okay. So very famously or infamously, there were actually two territorial representatives. So Hawaii, that's the equivalent of having state legislators today. Sanji Abe and Thomas Sakakihara, who were both interns. So obviously they were US citizens and elected officials. I have other cases here. Alf Harum, you see pictured there, was a Norwegian composer who founded the Honolulu Symphony Orchestra, now the Hawaii Symphony Orchestra. He's a well-known composer. You can get his works, find his works, Google for them. And he was from Norway, but by the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Norway had been invaded and occupied by Germany, so he counted as German. His wife, Leslie White Harum, was not ethnic German or ethnic Norwegian. She had, as far as I can tell, English ancestry, was born in the Kingdom of Hawaii, right? But she was interned as well because her husband was quote unquote German, even though he was actually Norwegian. Clara Lutters, that one is an interesting case. She was married to a German who had been naturalized as a US citizen, but she was Irish. And in her hearing, they were trying to figure out if her ancestors, she grew up in San Francisco. I mean, there was no illusion here that they all agree that she was born and raised in the United States of America. She grew up in San Francisco. They wanted to find out if her family had been from Northern Ireland or the Republic of Ireland. They determined she was very anti-English, which, I mean, not shocking for some Irish folks for historical reasons. And they ordered her interned for the entirety of the war because they said that she had fascist sympathies or Nazi sympathies. Her son, by the way, was a Stanford engineering graduate and served in the US Navy. What is his mother was interned? Okay. Herb and Nikki Walter, and I realize I'm moving a little bit more quickly because I know we have to kind of play catch up with time. That was an interesting case that I've written about. They were a couple that were ethnic. They were actually German. They were German Americans, naturalized citizens. In their case, the interesting thing was they had a witness a friend of theirs that testified in their favor, and then he was called back. I suspect the FBI agent got back to him, and then so everyone, it would seem clear that the Walters were a very patriotic American family. So Nikki Walter had organized a fundraiser for the Committee to Defend America after the attack on Pearl Harbor. But this one witness flipped. I suspect the FBI agent got to him, and he came back and testified a second time at the hearing and said when he visited their home, he said they were too patriotic, that they, quote, he was over-entertained at their home, saying, quote, there was a little too much Americanism, end quote. So the idea here then was that it was suspicious because they were too patriotic. So they were ordered to be continued to be interned. Karl Armfelt was someone who was from half Swedish, half Finnish nobility. He was a naturalized US citizen. He was 23 years old at the time he was arrested, at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack. He was a US military veteran. And he was interned because Finland at that time was at war with the Soviet Union, which was an ally of the United States. So that meant that they viewed him as an enemy, an alien enemy, even though he was a US citizen and a war veteran. And they also said that he had fascist sympathies. And the last one I'll mention here, Mariel Valdastri, I spoke about on the radio show this morning, a really amazing case. So he was a naturalized citizen from Italy, originally from Italy. He had been in Hawaii for 30 years by this time. He was a very successful contractor with skills in plastering. He'd worked on Honolulu Hale, and he owned a large property out in Kailua. So he was actually not a US citizen, but a US combat veteran. He fought in World War I for the US Army in Europe. And he was friendly with a group of Italians, one of whom worked at the Italian consulate, and that's what ostensibly got him interned. And I mentioned this morning, but I found a letter. I don't know if it ever got to its intended audience, which was President Roosevelt, but this is a guy in his 50s, and he wrote a letter to President Roosevelt from the internment camp saying, "I'm a loyal American. I fought for this country in World War I. Take me out of this camp and send me into the dangerous front in the world, and I will gladly fight again for my country." His daughter was getting married, and Mariel Valdastri was in the Honouliuli internment camp, although he was in medical leave most of the time at Tripler Hospital. He asked for a one-day pass to attend his daughter's wedding. I actually misspoke at the Hawaiian Public Radio talk and said funeral, sorry. His daughter's wedding, and it was denied. Before he was released from internment, she tragically died in a car accident, and he never got to see his daughter again. Okay, so how awful is that? Oops. So another myth, the US government was a monolith. Clearly not. A couple of quick examples. So there were competing voices, competing opinions and views. Generally speaking, the folks in DC favored a mass large-scale internment more than the folks in Hawaii. So for example, Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox wanted to round up all the quote, Japs, his word actually, and put them on some other island on Oahu. And General Emmons, who was the second military governor who took over for short, he dragged his heels, right, as much as possible. He would say, and I think this was an intended exaggeration, but he wrote back in one correspondence and said, 90% of the licensed contractors here in Hawaii are Japanese. So if we intern them all, who's going to build the camps? And then they said, okay, well, rather than put them on boats, ship them to the mainland. We got camps on the mainland. He's like, so you want me to ship 150,000 people? Like, I need cargo space for supplies. I need to move troops. I need to win a war here. I don't have time to, this is not going to help the war cause. And a similar dynamic between J. Edgar Hoover and Robert Shivers. Hoover was very distrustful of alien enemies in general, including the Japanese in Hawaii. And Robert Shivers, on the other hand, argued 98% of the Japanese in Hawaii, so he was the FBI director in Hawaii, 98% of the folks here, the Japanese, are loyal. It's just really 2% that we have to worry about. This slide, I wish I had more time to spend on it, but we lost a little time because of my technical incompetence earlier. This is another myth. Internees didn't resist. So this is why it's also interesting to look at the German-American internees, because there was a group of them that actually filed habeas corpus challenges. So 13 German and Italian Americans were shipped from Hawaii, and they're US citizens. They were shipped from Hawaii to Wisconsin in 1942. And one, Hans Zimmerman, was the first. His wife filed a habeas corpus challenge in the district court in Honolulu. Of course, we were under martial law. And so the judge, you see here, Metzger, was confronted with armed military presence in his courtroom. So he denied the request for a writ, but he said Zimmerman was entitled to one as a matter of course, but that he felt under duress because of the military presence. And so that gave Zimmerman grounds for appeal. It was about to go, okay, well, I should actually mention a little bit of this. And the ACLU was the one assisting in the case. So the circuit court ruled against him, but then his wife pursued it was about to take it up to the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, the case was going to the highest levels of the U.S. government. The Assistant Secretary, I think it's just Secretary of War, John J. McCloy, warned General Eisenhower that they don't have any legal justification for interning U.S. citizens in concentration camps, his word, on the mainland, because there's no martial law there. So they only have legal justification to do that in Hawaii, where there's martial law. So he suggested, and then Secretary of War Stimson suggested, why don't we just return them all to Hawaii, where martial law exists and they can still be detained. So Zimmerman and the others went back to Hawaii, and then one day before the case was set to be filed to the Supreme Court, they sent him back to the mainland again and released him, because then there were no grounds, right, for his wife to file it, because he was free. But so that was the way they didn't want a Supreme Court case that would undermine the internment, complex situation on Hawaii or on the mainland as well. So I'll skip over the second case for now and just quickly go to kind of closing comments, and we can wrap it up for questions. So there's always this tension between the desire for security and the desire to preserve our civil liberties, right? And it's very important to stress, although I haven't done it until right now, that in the first couple of weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, there was a legitimate fear of a full-scale land invasion, that the Japanese could launch a land invasion of Oahu. There was still in December of 1941, shellings of the harbors on Maui and Kauai. There was submarine activity all around, Japanese submarine activity off the coast of the Hawaiian Islands. So they're legitimate, right? The public really did want security, and many people welcomed the presence of the U.S. military. There is, though, this dragnet problem, or upena poi poi problem, where you're going to catch fish, what you want, but you're going to catch a lot. You're going to have a lot of false hits, right? You're going to get a lot of other things stuck on in your net. So you might have probably did catch some disloyal, maybe not subversive to many, but folks through this process. But you caught up a lot of innocent folks as well, right? Like the sort of U.S. Army veterans, high school students, Jewish refugees, right? The Alien Enemies Act, relevance today, maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A. That justification is being used, of course, again today as a pretext for incarcerating folks. And habeas corpus is also, right, coming under challenge today. There are a number of suits that are being filed against the Trump administration. It's interesting, though, from my research about what was going on in World War II, the U.S. officials, and it went all the way up to the Secretary of War, as I said, and even to President Roosevelt, they had no pretense whatsoever that they had any legal authority to detain U.S. citizens lawfully on the mainland. They only felt that that's why they had to release them in the end when these suits came up. They could only have them detained without any trial, right? Without habeas corpus in Hawaii, because martial law was present. And the final point, and I'll make it really shorter than I wanted to, but the importance of allies. So there were a lot of local people that came to the aid of the internees on Hawaii and tried to make their life better. On Hawaii, so let's see if we can. On Kauai, for example, the local library donated books and games to the internees there. The local engineers built a better dormitory facility. There were local church groups because they had congregants. Some of the pastors had congregants who were internees, so they tried to intervene to help them as well. The American Friends Society, the Quakers, did a lot of welfare work to help the dependents of those who were interned and lost their means to livelihood as well. And then there was these folks like, who were authorities, but who tried to prevent a larger scale internment, like Delos Emmons and like Robert Shippard. So I'll stop it there. I know folks, we want to keep everything on time. We have a couple of minutes to wrap up, and I'm happy to take questions as well. Thank you so much for attending this talk and sticking with me, and I'll stop the share here. And then I'm so relieved I don't have to do any more screen sharing and slide forwarding.
Thank you so much, Alan, for that illuminating presentation. I think we all learned a lot about this part of history. Before we move it to questions, I just want to say that This event is part of Honouliuli's 10th anniversary. So every month we have a theme. Every month we have virtual speakers. So if you enjoyed this talk, we are going to have our next one next Tuesday at the same time. I have the link in the chat. So if you have questions, please type them in the chat, either for me or for Alan regarding this presentation or the history of Honouliuli or anything else. We have about 3 minutes.
I didn't leave them much time. That's my
It's all good.
And we do have there were a couple of comments from Kirsten Downey, so thank you for that. Yeah, there were a lot. I'd say the folks in DC, a lot of them. Oh, this is actually contrary though. Thank you, Kirsten. She says there's someone who's opposed to the Japanese internment. Yeah, thank you. And she also wrote that the granddaughter of Otto Kuhn wrote a book and admitted that he was a spy for the Japanese. Thank you. Thank you all for turning out.
Yes, this presentation is recorded and it will be posted on our website and also YouTube at a later date.
And Edna, just fast forward the first 5 minutes because that was me bumbling through the screen sharing. And Edna, just fast forward the first 5 minutes because that was me bumbling through the screen sharing. Oh, yeah, I didn't talk at all about the POWs. Suzanne Falgu knows a lot about that. That was her area of focus. I was just talking about the civilian internees. Thank you, Dr. Falgu. Yes, there were many POWs that were in much larger numbers than internees that were incarcerated or held in the Honouliuli internment site. And many of them were Koreans, and the American authorities realized pretty quickly they had to actually separate the Japanese from the ethnic Koreans because they were not getting along. And the Koreans made it very clear, and usually they were eager to cooperate with the U.S. authorities. And we're not always happy with their Japanese counterparts. All right, folks. Well, Korean internees. So we undoubtedly, yes. So I only know that I said Dr. Chinan looked at the names of the Japanese internees and found 12 to 15% probably were actually Okinawan. I don't know if anyone has done that. I'm not aware of anyone who's done that to see if because it's kind of tricky. You'd have to be a bit of a cultural expert because the Korean people of Korean ethnicity or Japanese subjects also have Japanese names, but there probably is a way to figure out which of those folks are Korean if you're an expert in that area. Of local Japanese who resisted. Yes, it's a clear history of JAs on the continent. Yeah, I would say for Christine Mark, if that's it, I haven't come across cases of outright resistance. It depends, there might be subtle types of resistance, of course, but what the internee population of the Japanese American population of Hawaii is noted for is really the incredible numbers. When they formed, the government formed a 442 in all Japanese infantry, the volunteer numbers were off the charts. And the Japanese enlistment in the U.S. Army for Hawaii was percentage-wise, was much higher than the overall enlistment percentage. So despite all the terrible things that happened to Japanese Americans in Hawaii and their community, they were more likely to serve in the U.S. Army during World War II, and with great valor and honor, as we know.
I hate to cut it off. I'm so sorry. I do want to respect people's time. And I know we have some unanswered questions. I'm sure that, I don't know, Alan, if you would be open to emails if people had lasting questions. I do want to answer a few really quickly. So Mariko Miho, our Korean POW presentation was unfortunately delayed. So our speaker, Mary Danico, had to reschedule, and we will be posting that date soon once it is finalized again. And I also want to say to Wensheng Wang that there are differences between the Hawaiian and mainland internment processes and the differences between Hawaii and the mainland as far as that goes on our website. So I encourage you to read up on our website for that. So thank you everybody for joining, and I hope to see you again next Tuesday for our next Hidden Histories speaker series. Thank you everyone. Have a great evening or morning or wherever you are.